Hello everyone, this is Faculty in Focus, a new video series produced here at Marymount University. I'm Communications Specialist Nick Munson, and in this series I interview various professors and instructors across campus who share their unique approaches to teaching and research. And today we have Leigh Johnson with us, Associate Professor of Literature and Languages, as we hone in on writing about the sanctuary movement. First off, Leigh, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Nick. Very happy to be here. Excited.
Tell me a little bit about your background, your teaching experience, what brought you to Marymount, and how long you've been here for.
Great. I came to Marymount about 9 years ago. I was at University of New Mexico before here, and I taught Chicano and Chicano literature, American literature. Here I teach those as well. I teach writing, I teach gender studies, a wide variety of things, all of which I'm interested in doing, but most of my research focus is on Latinx literature.
Okay. Well, let's start at the beginning with the sanctuary movement. Can you give us a summary of what it's about and how it got started and progressed to where we see it today in 2020?
That's a big task, but I'll be brief.
That could take like an hour just in itself.
So the sanctuary movement came out of the crises in Central America in the 1980s, especially with the dictatorships and the process of disappearing people. And so the Catholic Church was really involved in the sanctuary movement.
El Salvador was a
yes,
big point
exactly.
for that, right?
El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And so refugees would come through Mexico, and then often they were on their way to Canada because the United States didn't resettle as many Central American refugees as perhaps they could have. Only about 20% of folks who applied for asylum in the United States were granted asylum. Canada took in several refugees, but there was sort of they call it similar to an underground railroad of moving refugees from south to north. So the Catholic Church was really involved, the Quakers were really involved, and it was a wide coalition of people working with a similar goal, coming at it from lots of different backgrounds. In the mid-'80s, Chicano and Chicana activists really became involved and sort of saw it as a commitment to a pan-Latino identity. And so one of the things that I've been interested in the sanctuary movement is how do different people come to the movement? How do they write about their experiences working with the refugees and the movement? And unfortunately, if people watch the news, they've seen discussions about migrants from Central America. Some of it is still government-related. Much of it is gang-related and violence-related. Right. But there's still a need for asylum and refugees and people to help them. And the Catholic Church remains a supporter of the refugees, especially along the border. We have Sister Norma coming to Marymount in a couple of weeks. I'm very excited to hear her speak. And now it's really interesting because a lot of those refugees who came in the 1980s are writing their own stories now. And so that's another part of the puzzle that I've been very interested in.
I'm interested, since you were at University of New Mexico, did you go there kind of with a mind of this is an idea that I'm passionate about, learning about, and want to teach about? Or was it something where you were at University of New Mexico, being a border state? Obviously, this is a big topic down there, and kind of piqued your interest there. How did that come about?
Well, I was very interested in Chicana and Chicana feminism because that's what I had started studying at Western Kentucky University, and wanted to go somewhere where I could learn more and be more immersed in the theories and the process and the practice. When I got to University of New Mexico, I did some work with my students and relationships with domestic violence shelters in Albuquerque and food banks and so forth, and saw how migration flows were really affecting some of the need in the community. And then, of course, discovered new authors like Demetri Martinez, who is from New Mexico. One of my students was her niece. So a small world. And I didn't know that before we had started reading the book in class. But Martinez was really involved in the sanctuary movement. She was even arrested. She was one of the only journalists arrested in connection with the sanctuary movement because she'd written a poem about women who were crossing the border, and the government used her poem as evidence that she had been collaborating and assisting refugees. So mostly got interested there in the subject. It didn't fit into my dissertation, so it's been a project that I've been working on since I got here as part of a bigger project on how white women and Latinas write about history and historical events, but they do it in different ways to send different messages to protect different communities and promote different communities.
Yeah. So talking about Central America, like you said, the sanctuary movement kind of came about from the activities and incidents that happened in the 1980s in several countries in Central America. What was the situation in those countries like, and what kind of precipitated those mass exodus of refugees going north?
Well, it was unpredictable and violent. And so one of the things that was really hard for people was not being able to know what had happened to their friends and relatives, and not being able to know when something might happen to them. And so I think the uncertainty was one of the things that really was the push factor in terms of moving people out. And of course the violence. But nuns, priests, children, no one was immune to the violence. And I think that was something that really sparked indignation from activists on the U.S. side of the border, that they saw that this was a real injustice. And so writers started interviewing subjects. People would come and give their testimonies to different groups, and that would spur more financial contributions and help for the refugees. And but the situation in each of the countries was a little bit different, but similar enough that it was seen as sort of a wider movement. So I would like to talk just a little bit about the way that Barbara Kingsolver wrote her story. She wrote The Bean Trees in the late 1980s, and it's about a girl who moves from Kentucky to Arizona. So not
very
unlike
similar
myself.
to someone I know. Yeah.
I know. But Kingsolver also is from Kentucky and moved to Arizona, and I think this is where she discovered this same crisis. And so in a letter to my mother, she has, from Small Wonder, she says, "I'm somewhere between 30 and 100, and I've written a book, my first novel, but it seems to me more like the longest letter to you I've ever written. Finally, after 1,000 tries, I've explained everything I believe in, exactly the way I always wanted to. Human rights, Central American refugees, the problem that has no name, abuse of the powerless, racism, poetry, freedom, childhood, motherhood, sisterhood is powerful, all that, and still some publisher has decided it makes a good story." And I think that's really funny the way she puts that, because it's as if she thinks she's never going to write another book. And anyone who's a little bit familiar with Kingsolver, she's really widely published the Poisonwood Bible, but The Bean Trees is her first novel, and it's really where you can see a lot of her heart coming out. But what I think is really interesting is Demetri Martinez read The Bean Trees, and that was one of the ways she was like, oh, I could write about this too. And so she was talking about having read Kingsolver's book, sparking her own interest in writing about the Central American refugees and the sanctuary movement too. Right. So I think that it's not an artificial comparison to think about how this conversation evolves and develops among these writers.
The powers of the stories of these individual refugees, is pretty powerful, I'm sure, and it's inspired all of this work from various authors. What are some of those stories that maybe stick out in your mind when you think about the sanctuary movement?
One of the things I think is really interesting is the way that the authors portray the relationships between the activist, or the person who's assisting the refugee, and the refugees themselves. And where does the author put agency in that relationship? Is it this idea of somebody rescuing someone and saving them, or does the refugee have some personal agency of their own that they bring to this? And so at first I thought, well, we're going to see these first world American writers writing as if they're the saviors. But as I was doing more work and reading more information and reading more of the stories, I realized that it's a more delicate balance. That for instance, Demetri Martinez focuses on a 19-year-old girl living in Albuquerque whose godmother says to her, "I need you to take in this refugee just for a few days. Don't fall in love with him." Well, of course, that's what's happening.
Setting the scene.
Right, exactly. But one of the things that's so fascinating about the novel is how powerful his testimony is to the groups that he speaks to. And so then it raises questions of who gets to speak, whose pain is important, how do you heal from something like this kind of trauma. And I just really love the way that Maria, who's the girl, positions herself. She says, "In that time of my life, men were mirrors that allowed me to see myself at different angles. Outside this function, they did not exist. It was a supreme selfishness, the kind that feeds on men's attentions, a void flourishing in a void. Jose Luis would have none of it. When desire flickered across my face, he extinguished it with talk about El Salvador. The Civil War, death squads, landowners. His struggles were too large and unwieldy to be folded up and dropped into my palm like alms. In the end, I had no choice but to love him." And so I think it's a really interesting setup, and students love this story. It goes really fast.
Yeah.
It's got it's not a totally happy ending, but it works really well. But you can see that there's a lot of tension between the kind of trauma he's experienced and the kind of uncertainty in her own identity that she brings to the table and to their relationship. And so part of the story is about the way that they grow, and he goes to Canada, so he kind of disappears from her life, even as she's concerned about her own identity. And it's a really interesting way of positioning the activist and the refugee in a relationship that some people have power in some ways and some have power in other ways. And King Salvador does a very different way of presenting that. But the stories do work together really well, because there's always the question of attachment and love, even as they're trying to fix someone into a new life that's totally foreign to what they've experienced up to this point.
It's very interesting. When you talk about incorporating these stories into the classroom, maybe what are some of your methods to open students' eyes to what happened back then in the 1980s and its lingering effects to this day?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a topic that students are interested in, especially here. A lot of our students are Latinx. Some of them, home countries are El Salvador, Guatemala.
Honduras.
Right, and so, but they were too young in the 1980s or not born yet in the 1980s for them to have
their parents.
But their parents may have been affected. And so in some ways we talk a little bit about the history, but I really like to use Martinez's poem, A Nativity for Two Salvadoran Women, which is the poem that she wrote when she interviewed the women and met them on the border. And she writes this poem, and then it follows up with a couple of great articles from the LA Times about her arrest and defense on First Amendment grounds, and sort of her positioning as a journalist. And so students can sort of see how literature is not just a story made up that may have universal themes and symbols that we can dissect, but that it has like real impact in the way that people think about the world and the kinds of experiences that are valuable enough to publish. And so I think that's really powerful for students. We often read Mother Tongue because it is short and it works really well in several of the classes that I teach. But I do like to show them it's not all fun and games and love and happy endings, because we have Helena Maria Viramontes' story, The Caribou Cafe, in which a woman from Guatemala whose child was disappeared in Guatemala kidnaps a child in Texas, and sort of the consequences of that. And so this story is really hard, whereas this story is really easy. And so exposing them to those two different stories told basically at the same time about the same moment of history and how they can really be so divergent helps students realize that there's not just one story. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says it's really important to not have just a single story told about an event. So that's one of the things that I think with poetry and short stories and shorter pieces of fiction, we can really tell lots of pieces of that story, and students will find a part that makes them, that resonates with them and makes them feel something, and makes them feel more educated about what's happening now or what's happened in their own families, backgrounds, and so forth.
Right, yeah, it's very important. What else do you do to maybe make these stories relevant and really try to reach the student when they're just starting to learn about these events?
We map the stories. So I ask the students to draw the novel. So this one, it seems like it only takes place in Albuquerque's Old Town. So we start there, and then we're like, well, is there any other part? Like, are there other pieces? And so then they kind of just start adding pieces to the narrative, like, oh, this happened here. And we start to see that this story that seems like it's enclosed in a home or enclosed in a small part of one city actually sprawls to include so much more of the world. Not just El Salvador, but there's parts of this that spread out to Asia or Africa. And so then that helps students really see the impact of what seems like something that's encased is much larger, has much more wide-reaching impacts, and that's something that they can visually map from the text, and that really is helpful. It helps too that, for instance, this author, Valeria Luiselli, is coming to speak at Marymount. She's coming through the Arlington Public Library's author series, and all of the students in English 102 are reading her short essay called Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions. And she makes a great point in that essay that the events in Honduras, she's mostly focused on Honduras, and Central America at this point in time are partly a result of policies and demand from U.S. people for drugs and for cheap labor and for other things. And then she also says, Mexico is involved in this too. And so she was born in Mexico. She lives in the United States now. But one of her points is, as Mexicans, we can't let ourselves off the hook for this crisis too. We can't just say it's a U.S. created crisis, but it expands. And so having her come and speak will be really impactful for students as well, putting a face to it. I love Maya Chinchilla. She has some great videos of herself giving the spoken word poems that she writes here, so we do occasionally watch what she has to say. I just love the way she puts this. Mommy and Poppy were planning solidarity, baby, organizing dreams, taking on telling the truth, running the Central American Underground Railroad through my living room. My second-hand clothes, given third-hand with first-rate love, giving the little we had to those who had less. This is my inheritance. And so she's one of those authors I was talking about that is second generation. And I love the idea of contrasting first, second, third world ideas with the clothing and sort of that visual image of taking what she has and trying to turn it into more, and so so all of those kinds of things I think impact students' learning.
My final question today would be, why is it important to study these topics at Marymount specifically, and how does Marymount's core values and mission impact the quality of learning about the sanctuary movement?
I think that in many ways it helps our students understand where they are, and they see how the mission of people involved in the sanctuary movement came from a place that wanted to recognize the humanity of all people. And that's part of Marymount's mission, is to educate the whole person and have these conversations that include faith, that include doubt, that are questions of, are they doing the right thing for the right reasons? And being able to be aware of a variety of perspectives, I think, is really valuable in the classroom, on the campus. We're an incredibly diverse campus. These are diverse perspectives on a really difficult topic that involves a lot of trauma for a lot of people. And being able to understand that coming at that from different perspectives will be powerful, I think, is a really, it meshes nicely with our mission. It makes us more aware and more empathetic for having heard these stories.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to cover today?
Thanks so much for letting me talk about it, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it's eye-opening for me as well, and I'm sure for many of our viewers, everyone has their own specific, points of expertise. So it's great to always hear one of yours and other faculty members as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
And that'll wrap this episode up for Faculty in Focus. We'll see you next time.